Today we'll be discussing the award-winning movie, The Power of the Dog, and we'll be discussing Anthrax. This is Doctor vs. Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing the recent award-winning movie, The Power of the Dog, and we'll be discussing Anthrax. What causes it?
Now, when you say Anthrax, do you mean the band, the metal band, Anthrax?
I didn't, but I guess we could.
We could bring the noise,
there you go.
A great collaboration with Public Enemy.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's what we meant. I meant the disease anthrax. We could talk about what causes it, how you contract it, how you treat it.
Sure. Okay. That's also good.
Yeah. Okay.
But also people should look up the band. They were great. They were trailblazers.
I want to ask you, Ali, about this movie, The Power of the Dog. It, has won tons of awards, as we all know. A very big movie for Netflix and for Jane Campion. You watched it.
Jane Campion being the director, in case people aren't as director-centric as you are.
I apologize. You told me about it a couple months ago, actually, at the end of 2021. You said you loved it. It was the best thing you've ever. I'm exaggerating, but you
totally exaggerating.
You spoke very highly of it. So I thought we should talk about it. So I don't know. Why don't we talk a bit about the background of the movie and some interesting facts, and then we can kind of each talk about what we thought about it.
Okay. Why not?
So this, as we mentioned, is a movie directed by Jane Campion. It's based on a novel by Thomas Savage, which has the same name. And Jane Campion filmed it in her native New Zealand, even though it takes place in America. New Zealand stands in for that. Amazing vistas. It's a beautifully shot movie. And then has these big name actors. There's 4 main roles. You have Benedict Cumberbatch as Phil Burbank, one of the main characters. His brother's played by Jesse Plemons, who you guys might know from Friday Night Lights. He's been in tons of movies since that time.
Fargo,
yes. Yeah. And then also from Fargo, Kirsten Dunst plays George Burbank's eventual love interest and wife. And of course, in real life, Kirsten Dunst and Jesse Plemons are married.
It's too crazy.
Yeah. And then Kodi Smit-McPhee plays Kirsten Dunst's son in the movie. He's a great actor as well. I, of course, remember him for playing Nightcrawler from the newer X-Men movies.
Yes. The goth superhero.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Do you want to just give a quick kind of synopsis of the movie without spoiling anything?
Well, I mean, eventually we'll have to spoil it. I mean, that's how these things work. But before we do, we'll let you know that we're spoiling it. But yeah, this is... Okay, so let me just tell you this, Asif. The reason you got a message from me was because I expected so little of this movie. It was it was somewhere in the top 10 on Netflix. I didn't know anything about it. And sometimes, and I think you agree with this, sometimes going into a movie with zero knowledge, having read nothing about it, is the best way to really enjoy a movie. I think you do that now. That's your MO.
Yeah, it's interesting. That? I used to always read as much as I could about movies, and now I'm moving away from that as I get older. And, all the Oscar-nominated movies this year, I didn't read anything about them, really, and then I just went into them cold. So similar to what you did.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do it by design. It just, we didn't know anything about it, and my wife and I... it's a clock. It's ticking down at night. She's got her I'm going to fall asleep soon. I'm I don't have much left in me. Either we watch a half an hour episode times 2 or we watch a movie. So we happen to have enough time in us physically to bear one movie. And even that, sometimes it's no, can't do it. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes. So anyway, this movie, we had time for it. We were okay, fine.
Oh my gosh, that's how I do the same thing. If it's over 2 hours, I'm usually, I can't do that. One night, I can't do it. And of course, you want to give the filmmaker, they did a 2 hour plus movie and they want you to watch it all in one sitting. So dividing it up between 2 days or however long it takes you to watch it, just not really fair to them. So I try and dedicate that time, but sometimes I just can't.
How sweet of you to think of the filmmaker. It's also not fair to the filmmaker to be I loved the movie, but the last 20 minutes I was dozing off, right? And that's also not fair to you for your own movie watching experience. So anyway, we had the time. I mean, I don't even know why we watched it in the end. I really don't know exactly why, but it was like, why not?
Mm-hmm.
We went into it with a, why not? Let's see. If we don't like it in 10 minutes, we'll bail out. And so sometimes that's the best way to watch a movie. At least that's what I would say about Power of the Dog. I don't really know Jane Campion's work, looked her up after the fact. Jesse Plemons we immediately recognized because my wife and I had watched Fargo together, one of the few shows we'd watched together. And then Kirsten Dunst comes along into the movie. We're like, wait a second. This is the same duo from Fargo. Later found out, as you say, that they're a married couple. Benedict Cumberbatch, let me just be completely frank. Only 1 year ago did I stop calling him Engelbert Cumberbatch. I mean, this guy's name is too much of a mouthful for me. I don't know him well. I don't know his work well, only because of him playing Doctor Strange in these, what's that universe called? Avengers? As a
the Marvel Cinematic Universe, indeed.
Yeah, Cinematic Universe. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Only because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe has he really come to... he has an incredible body of work that I didn't know much about. That said, his performance in this movie I found very, very impressive. It's my goal when I'm doing any acting is not to oversell and overact, or even to act. If anybody knows what the Meisner method is, you can look that up if you have an interest in acting, but I took a couple of Meisner classes, and our teacher would always berate us by saying, you're acting. And I was like, I thought I was taking an acting class. I thought I was supposed to be acting. Acting is not what you're supposed to do. Acting means you're pretending. The idea behind Meisner and many other acting techniques is don't pretend. Don't play somebody playing something. Just be. And I really found that Benedict Cumberbatch was this person. He was being this character. So this movie, anyway, let me just get to the, right now this is kind of a sales pitch. So as Asif said, it is a novel, 1967 novel called The Power of the Dog. What does it mean? Looked it up after the fact. It is the 22nd psalm? Psalm? P-psalm?
I think the P is
silent. I don't know how to
silent.
pronounce that word. Psalm from the King James Bible. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling, from the power of the dog. To this moment, I still don't know what that has to do with this movie. I am not intelligent enough to understand metaphors, and I don't know what power of the dog means. You'll tell me.
Yeah,
what
so
that
I read
means.
an interview with Jane Campion on IndieWire.
Okay.
We'll link to it. So she says, I didn't understand it either, but she says the power of the dog is the urges, kind of those animalistic urges, the uncontrollable urges that destroy us. And when you read that, you're like, okay, I kind of understand, because there are at least two characters in this who have these underlying urges that you could describe as animalistic. Maybe, definitely one of them does, without spoiling the movie. So that's kind of where it comes in. And it's almost the last scene of the movie, you see this text written. So yeah, that's where the name comes from.
As you said, cinematically, unbelievable. I was like, God dang it, Montana is beautiful. Turns out it wasn't Montana, it was New Zealand, as you said. Montana is probably still beautiful, big sky country and all that. So immediately I was pulled in by the cinematography, and I was also pulled in by the understated acting. And gosh, if you're not well rested, I can see how you would say this movie is boring. Nothing happens. But if you have a little bit of energy in you, the nothing happening, there's something so beautiful about it. And, you were exaggerating by saying that this movie, I don't know where you were going with that, this movie changed my life or whatever you were going to say, but it was really incredibly impressive. Now, I love cinematography, but more than anything else, I love acting. And then sometimes I'll think about the directing, like, oh, that was an interesting directorial choice that was made. All those things were in my mind, but also they weren't front of mind. I wasn't thinking about those. It's just a movie that sort of grabs you in, and you're like, okay, this is your tone. This is your energy. It's slow, but I'm here for the journey. And I really thought it was quite interesting. There's one thing that I was that took me a while to get into, which is the fact that Benedict Cumberbatch and Jesse Plemons are brothers. Like the least brotherly looking brothers. Anyway, once you get over that, this is the Burbank brothers are, they have a mansion, but like many people from that day, it's this, in the New Yorker, it was said combination of hard physical work and quiet wealth that characterize these old ranches. And that's what they do. They work extremely hard, particularly Benedict Cumberbatch. And, we learn about him that Benedict Cumberbatch, he looks like just this, dirty, old, uncouth person. But it turns out he is Phi Beta Kappa Yale graduate who has eschewed all connection to, wealthy society and that upper class. So when his brother, George, played by Jesse Plemons, says, "You please clean yourself up. The governor is coming to dine," he says, "No luck. I stink and I like it." Later, you'll find out, as you do some reading, that he actually stank.
Like in real life, he went all method actor for this.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I mean, who's to say if that's necessary or not necessary? But I will say that I found it to be a pretty terrific performance.
Yeah, and just to finish with the synopsis, I mean, then the conflict kind of comes into this movie when George, played by Jesse Plemons, meets Kirsten Dunst's character and kind of wants to settle down with her, and Benedict Cumberbatch has some issues with that. And then, of course, it also introduces, as we said, the son of Kirsten Dunst's character, Peter Gordon, and how he gets involved in all this. And I think that's probably where we should leave the synopsis without spoiling anything in terms of what happens in this movie. A couple of things of trivia that you may not have known there, Ali. One is that Elizabeth Moss, who's worked with Jane Campion in the past, Elizabeth Moss from Mad Men is how most people know her, and The Handmaid's Tale, she was supposed to play Kirsten Dunst's role.
Supermodel?
No.
Supermodel Elizabeth Moss? That's some other Moss.
Yeah, who's that?
Well, you opened this with saying that you may not know, so I went to my least knowing part of my brain.
Yeah, no,
okay, Elizabeth Moss.
Yeah, no, Elizabeth Moss, great actress. Anyway, by the way, here's a funny story about Elizabeth Moss. She was married for a very short time to Fred Armisen, and she was interviewed afterward. They got divorced, and they said, why did you get divorced? And she's like, well, Fred does a really good acting job of trying to be a human being. It's like the craziest thing. And you're like, oh my God. Anyway, you guys got to look that up. I'll see if I can find that quote, that interview from her. Anyway, that's a total digression. She was supposed to play Kirsten Dunst's role. I think it was The Handmaid's Tale. There was too much overlap, so she couldn't, make it work. And then Paul Dano's been in lots of movies. He was in Prisoners, that great thriller from a couple of years ago with Hugh Jackman, and he plays the Riddler in the new Batman movie. He was supposed to be Jesse Plemons' role, and that he couldn't do it for scheduling reasons as well. And so they kind of shifted to Kirsten Dunst and Jesse Plemons.
Yep. Paul Dano, for my money, the best thing that guy has ever done, and I'm sure he's done other great stuff, is his role as a teenager in Little Miss Sunshine.
Oh, yeah. He was great.
Playing character.
Excellent. I mean, he's a very, very good actor. Good. And as you said, more trivia, Benedict went full method for this. As you said, he didn't bathe. He smoked so many cigarettes in this movie that he got nicotine poisoning. Like, come on.
Kids, that's what happens when you go too method. You never go too method.
Yeah, that's right. And then the person who wrote the score for this movie is Johnny Greenwood. And do you know what band he is in?
I definitely don't.
He is the lead guitarist and keyboardist for Radiohead.
Oh, man.
So, we're seeing a lot of these guys who were these big artists in these big rock bands kind of moving into scoring. Trent Reznor does a lot of scores. He's been nominated for the Oscar several times. So it's cool. I didn't know that Johnny Greenwood does this. So that's basically it. So, okay. So we're going to transition here in a second. So this is full disclosure. So Ali and I talked about this, and he wants me to put in not just a spoiler warning, because we are about to talk about the ending of the movie and our opinions of it. So if you haven't seen the movie, you can...
We kind of have to, by the way. If we're talking about Anthrax next, we have to, illustrate for you clearly why we're talking about Anthrax. So the spoiler is not like, it's not to hurt your feelings. It's just, we have to.
Yeah.
It's just, there's no way around it.
Overall, Anthrax does have something to do with the movie, but maybe that's the most we'll say right now. But Ali also wanted to put a warning here that I'm about to give you my opinions of this movie. And he thinks, because I'm so influential to our listeners, it's going to taint your perception of the movie, whether you've already watched it or are about to.
Yes, please skip ahead if you don't want any spoilers. Look, here's my thing. I always remember my friend Q, our friend Q, who we love to death. He is a notorious spoiler for me. Other people would be like, "This, he's not spoiling the movie," but he does spoil the movie in the sense that, so Ratatouille, okay? You know,
there's a lot of suspense in that movie, so I'm sure it really got spoiled to you. He told you the rat knows how to cook. That's what he told you.
No, you know what he told me? He told me, make sure you have a tissue box handy. Ratatouille is super emotional. And I'm like, don't tell me that. He's like, what? I just said you're going to cry. That's all I said. And I was so ready for that. I didn't cry once. And I cry in movies. I do cry in movies. And I never cried once in Ratatouille because he put that
I didn't either.
I feel like you're doing
it was because of the grossness of a rat in the kitchen. I didn't cry for that. But anyway, I didn't cry in Ratatouille either. I had the same reaction as you. But so when someone prepares you for that, it kind of throws you off.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. And Asif is about to prepare you in his own special way.
That sounds like a you problem, not a listeners of Doctor versus Comedian problem. But anyway.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
So
we'll see.
Basically, what we'll put in the timestamps. So if the spoiler starts now, you could just skip over to our discussion of Anthrax. It will be in the show notes. Okay. Spoilers start now. Now.
Right now.
So, and we'll tie this in with my impressions of the movie. As you guys heard, Ali definitely liked the movie. And listen, I like this movie too. I think it's 3/4 of a pretty good movie, but a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, Jane Campion, I'm not a huge fan of, and I think I even said this a couple months ago on the podcast when you first told us that you watched this movie. But I give it a chance, obviously, because, it's, as we said, award-winning. I think her movies, people sometimes give them a bit more credit than they deserve in terms of how amazing they are. I think overhyped is kind of a lame criticism for a movie because, if you didn't read anything, you wouldn't know how hyped it was, right? So it would just maybe the same thing as you getting Ratatouille kind of spoiled for you because people are talking about it too much. But I've never been overly impressed by your movies. I do think it's beautiful. I think it looks amazing. The cinematography is probably the best of the year. And I think there are 3 amazing actors in this movie: Kirsten Dunst, Jesse Plemons, and Kodi Smit-McPhee, especially Kodi Smit-McPhee. They're all good, but God, he's such a good actor. I didn't even recognize him in this movie. That's how good he was. So, but Benedict Cumberbatch, listen, I really know him mainly from a few of his movies and the Marvel universe. I just didn't buy him at all. I think he only has 2 ways of acting: British guy and American guy. I thought he was acting he also plays the Grinch in the new CGI animated Grinch Who Stole Christmas, which is pretty good, much better than the Jim Carrey ones we've watched the past couple of Christmases with the family. He's playing the same character. He's playing the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, but dressed up as a cowboy. I kept thinking during this that he's trying to be Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood, cowboyish person who's a total douche. I don't know. I didn't buy it. I just thought he was pretty bad. And I think it hinges on the movie. The other strange thing about this movie is I watched it, and as I'm watching it, I'm like, what is the point of this? And that's, I know, kind of a lame criticism as well, but I watch lots of movies. I mean, listen, I watched all of Twin Peaks: The Revival by David Lynch. It makes no sense, but I loved every minute I watched it. And so it doesn't have to make sense but it just has to thematically hold together. And as I watched this, I'm like, what's the point of this movie? It's called a psychological drama, but it kind of turns into a thriller towards the end. And I don't know. And the other thing is, who's the main character? Because the main character in a movie should be the person who changes. It changes over time.
To our listeners, don't you feel like that's a spoiler? If somebody goes, I watched that movie and I thought the whole time, what's the point of this movie? I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that as a viewer. So I do think that's a spoiler. Way worse than my Ratatouille spoiler.
I don't know. So anyway, I thought that was good. I thought the ending kind of falls apart. I'm not sure it quite makes sense. And it kind of becomes this kind of thriller. And of course, so the spoiler is Kodi Smit-McPhee's character is so distraught by kind of the psychological trauma that Cumberbatch's character inflicts on Rose, played by Kirsten Dunst, that he devises this plan because he's in medical school to infect Benedict Cumberbatch's character with anthrax, and then he eventually dies. But all this was when Benedict Cumberbatch's character is actually kind of warming up to Kodi Smit-McPhee's character, because possibly, well, definitely Cumberbatch's character has some repressed homosexual tendencies or identity, and maybe Kodi Smit-McPhee's character does. That's never quite clear. So that's basically what happens. So the ending kind of turns into this, and then at the end, Cumberbatch dies, and everybody lives happily ever after. I don't know.
That is a pretty scathing review of Benedict and his life and him as a person. But look, as I told you, I just got his name right like 2 years ago. So I don't know. I don't have any of that emotional baggage that you do. I thought, being a lover of Marvel that you are, I thought you would, oh my God, Doctor Strange is in this. But of course you go way deeper than that and rip this man apart. British guy. And an American guy.
Yeah, so, I mean, listen, do I think the movie is worth watching? I actually do, because I think the other performances are so good, and it looks amazing. So I think it's a good movie. It's like a B, it's...
Yeah, and imagine how good those performances must be if Asif doesn't care for the lead, and also doesn't care for the director, and still says it's worth watching. So I would agree with that, and I don't want to overstate it, but by this time, you've had the movie spoiled for you anyway, if you're still listening to this part and you haven't watched it. But I think it is to be watched. Absolutely. So, as we've been mentioning, there is a loose connection between Power of the Dog and Anthrax. And I thought it was interesting to, I think we know what it is loosely, but people don't really understand maybe what anthrax is and what it does. And then there's another thing to talk about, which is the anthrax, I guess, attacks, or is that the way to say it? There were attacks that happened where people were opening their, some people of note, politicians were opening envelopes that contained anthrax in it. And there were actually, I don't know if people remember this, I certainly had forgotten, but people had died because of this. And I do remember this new fear coming to fore, which was, wait, should I be hyper concerned every time I open an envelope? Nobody wanted to kill me, as it turned out. But that's a thing. Like, that's a crazy thing, when you're a younger person, to be like, wait a minute. Am I now? Look, I had already seen the Seinfeld episode with George Costanza's wife licking those envelopes and then, getting poisoned and dying from that. Now I was like, wait, that's not a joke anymore. You can actually die if somebody wants to kill you. They can do it through your mail. So I think I'd love to discuss both those things.
Yeah, and they're both very interesting. And as I was looking up anthrax, I kind of did a deep dive into these attacks, as you said. And I forgot, like, for example, they occurred in 2001. Weeks after September 11th. And
that's crazy.
It's just so crazy. So I think, why don't we do this? We'll do two separate sections. We'll do this first section on anthrax, just talking about the bacteria and how it infects you and things like that. And then we'll do a separate section. I'll do a timestamp for those on our show notes so people can kind of go from one to the other if they want.
You're the boss, baby.
Okay. So anthrax, what is it? It's a disease caused by a bacteria. The bacteria is called Bacillus anthracis, and it occurs naturally in the soil. It's found all over the world, but more often in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and southern and eastern Europe and South and Central America. So more in warmer climates is where you find it, but it can occur anywhere.
Okay, so this is something that it exists organically. And then people with, ill intentions take that thing that's occurring organically in the earth and use it for...
Right. Yeah, we'll talk about how that ended up happening a bit later. But yeah, exactly. So it's a naturally occurring thing. It wasn't created in a lab or anything like that. So people get sick if they come in contact with infected animals or animal products. But you can't catch it from one person to another. So if a human has it, you cannot get it from them. It's only if you come in. Yeah, if
you can catch it from a living being, but that being has to be
animals,
an animal.
And so interestingly, there's actually 4 types of infections that you can get, and you kind of categorize them by either how you got them, how you contracted the anthrax, or what body system it's involved. So there's the first one is cutaneous anthrax, then there's inhalational anthrax, gastrointestinal anthrax is the third one, and the fourth one is injectional anthrax. So maybe we can just kind of go through these a bit because they're all a bit different. So that cutaneous form, so that's getting it on your skin, that is pretty mild. But the other 3, 1/3 of patients will die from the other 3, inhalational, gastrointestinal, and injectional.
So cutaneous is not that serious. You can recover from it.
Correct. But if you, say, had a cut on your hand, that would then become an injectional form, which would be very, very serious. So basically, the cutaneous anthrax is like 95% of the cases. You get the spores go into your skin, and then you get a painless swelling type lesion, which then forms what's called a black eschar on top of it, which is kind of like a black kind of scab that often doesn't go away. The inhalational form is like...
Painless.
Painless is strange, right?
Weirdest thing. Okay.
The inhalational form is called wool sorter disease, because I think it was from people who sorted wool in contaminated animals. You get the aerosolized spores, and then you get a severe pneumonia from that. The gastrointestinal form is if you eat contaminated food, and then you get ulcers all down your throat and your intestines, swelling of your body. Sounds quite, uncomfortable to say the least. And then the injectional one is usually with IV drug use, because there's a lot of contamination in some countries of heroin with anthrax. I'm not really sure exactly why. And so that could be very similar. So it looks similar to cutaneous, but then you get disseminated disease. In other words, it spreads to your entire body, and you can become very sick with that.
Well, I'm no heroin expert by any means. Wouldn't know it if it was staring me right in the face. But I guess you can imagine opium. Those poppies, they grow in fields, and in those fields could be animals or.
There was actually outbreaks of injectional anthrax in the United Kingdom in 2009 and 2010, and they thought it was from imported heroin from the Middle East that was somehow contaminated. Maybe that's how it was. I'll give you another interesting case. There was 2 cases of cutaneous anthrax in Connecticut, and this was from a family who in Connecticut made drums from goat hides imported from West Africa. So one of them was a drum maker, and one of them was actually a child of one of these drum makers, like one of the cases. And they just thought there was anthrax in the house, and he kind of got infected by that, even though the child wasn't making any drums.
It's like such a bad trip. It's like you have so many worries already for your health, and then to add anthrax to your worries. I'm back to 2001 again. You're getting me back to like, oh my God, should I go and inspect my drums from goat hides? I don't have any, but if I did, I would wash them or something. I don't know. This is crazy.
Yeah, well, occupation or activities that, involve working with animals or hides, like that's one of the main risk factors. And so, with the inhalational form, it's interesting. Like you usually start with it can seem minor at the beginning, where it looks like you just have a cough and flu-like symptoms about 4 days, and then you can get very sick after it's kind of incubated in your body and then spread. And then those patients can become very sick, and as we mentioned, they can die.
Can any of these 4 forms of anthrax be treated?
Yeah, and you use antibiotics for them. That's kind of the mainstay of treatment. And it depends on which form you have. So the more minor forms, you would just give one antibiotic, usually like a fluoroquinolone antibiotic like ciprofloxacin, something like that. There's other antibiotics you could use. And if you have the more severe forms, then you add on other antibiotics. So for example, if you have the systemic form with the IV route of infection, then you give 2 antibiotics. But if you have the systemic form with meningitis, like it looks like you have meningitis, but it's because of anthrax, 3 antibiotics. And then you can also give an antitoxin that will help these patients. So there definitely is treatment. The hard part is sometimes figuring out that's what people have, right? And especially in North America where it's less common, it might be hard to kind of figure out what's going on.
All right, let's talk about these attacks that were in 2001, even though I thought it was just like, I don't know, 7 years ago. That's how traumatic that was, that it lives, it lives in recent memory for me. But I'd forgotten until you mentioned it that it was in the weeks after 9/11 because, 9/11 was also this, like, not to downplay what happened, game-changing event, for Muslims as well, for people who lived in North America. You just sort of wondered, what does the future hold? Is this what life is? Is this something we're at risk at now? Is it, is this the beginning of something? And to have the anthrax attacks coupled in there, after you mentioned it, I was like, oh man, I do remember that, where we were just like, is the whole world going crazy? What's happening? How is this now part of the world? Luckily, they kind of went away, or they didn't ramp up, but they were pretty serious anyway. I'd love for you to go. You said you did a deep dive into it. I'd love for you to go back and walk us through that.
This, could probably be a whole podcast series, and it reminds me of we'll get to who the main suspect is, and there's evidence that he did it and evidence that he didn't do it. It's kind of like, reminds me of the first season of Serial, right? Like where you just don't know whether this person did it or not, and your mind keeps going back and forth. So it's very interesting. So as you said, occurred on September 18th, 1 week after the September 11th attacks. So these anthrax spores were put in envelopes and mailed to several news media outlets and to Democratic senators, Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. And overall, 5 people died and 17 others were infected. I forgot that people died from this. Imagine this, like that's how you died and your family has to deal with this. Oh. It's crazy. So they were mailed. So this is what they were able to piece together. They were mailed from a mailbox in Princeton, New Jersey, near Princeton University, actually. And because they tested a bunch of mailboxes, because they went backwards looking at where they were mailed from, the area, and they found that after looking at 600 mailboxes and testing them for anthrax, only one on Nassau Street in Princeton tested positive. And then the return address was a 4th grade class in a fictitious middle school. And so there was a note accompanying the anthrax. So you'd have the powder in there, and the envelopes were sealed really well. Some people say, and folded in a certain way, some people say that the perpetrator actually didn't want to infect people. He just wanted to send them warning, but he didn't actually want to. So, Ali, I have a screenshot here that I want you to read. These are the notes that were written to the various media outlets and to the senators, Daschle and Leahy. These were the notes that were accompanying them. So can you read these notes?
I can. Why do you want me to read it, for God's sake?
People think you're the terrorist.
Exactly. I am reading from something, 9/11/01. You cannot stop us, cannot, spelt incorrectly. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great.
Yeah, nobody take that clip out and then post that on social media of Ali saying that. So the other one reads, which was sent to the New York Post and NBC News, this is next. Take penicillin now. Penicillin's misspelled. Death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great. So it's interesting. Why would they say take penicillin now? because penicillin is another antibiotic that can be used for anthrax. So they're basically telling you what this is and what the treatment is. So it's very interesting that that was there, and that also kind of confounded investigators. Another thing that confounded investigators was after this, there was a bunch of copycat crimes where things that were not anthrax were mailed, like just harmless white powder was mailed to someone at the New York Times, for example. So it became very complicated to try and figure it out. So then what happened is the authorities interviewed, it was one of the biggest investigations in FBI history. They interviewed 9,000 people, conducted 67 searches, issued 6,000 subpoenas. They traveled to 6 continents trying to figure out what happened here.
Wow.
And of course, immediately after these attacks, the White House pressured Robert Mueller, who was the FBI director. We all know Mueller now, but he was the FBI director at the time. Who did he want to blame for this?
Muslims.
Yeah, Al-Qaeda, right? Because it would make the most sense. But that was kind of felt to not be the case after an investigation. And thankfully they didn't do that. So the first person they had as a person of interest was this guy, Stephen Hatfield, who was a prominent virologist. And the FBI publicly searched his apartment. So it wasn't like a clandestine operation. It was kind of well known. And basically, this guy's reputation was ruined afterwards.
Oh, he had nothing to do with it?
Had nothing to do with it. So he ended up suing years later the FBI, the Justice Department, and many others for violating his rights and his privacy. And he got a settlement in 2008 for $5.8 million. Also sued, just so you know, he sued the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and Reader's Digest as well.
Reader's Digest? Come on.
Reader's Digest just accumulate other articles? I didn't know that they had original reporting, and New York Times, that kind of fell through, that he didn't get any settlement from them, but he did get an undisclosed amount from Vanity Fair and Reader's Digest. So, but you know, like you said, his reputation as a virologist was ruined. His life was ruined. And of course, I'm bringing it up now. He did not do it. He's not a suspect, just so.
And neither did Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
So they did a lot of other dirty
stuff,
but not this.
So then it comes down to this guy named Bruce Ivins, not Evans, Ivins. So he worked for 18 years at the government's biodefense labs at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and he was a top biodefense researcher. So the issue was he ended up committing suicide on August 1st, 2008, at the age of 62, right when apparently what was reported was he was about to be charged with crimes related to this terrorist attack. So why was he a person of interest? When they did the analysis of the anthrax strains, because there's different strains that exist, there's one called the Ames strain, AMES, named after the location where it was kind of first uncovered in the U.S. This Ames strain is really only found in one specific place in America, which is at Fort Detrick, where Ivins worked.
Where he worked. Dude, this is very... Now I'm seeing why you were suggesting this would make a great podcast, because the White House is pressuring them to say Al-Qaeda just to, you know, pacify a nation that is already on edge. Then there's a Hatfield guy. After you just said they went to 6 continents and they subpoenaed so many people and they still got the wrong guy, ruined his life. Although that 5.8 million, I'm sure, made up for some of that, but he couldn't work. He couldn't, who's going to hire that guy? And this guy kills himself. What is it? Days, weeks before the FBI is about to charge him?
Well, that's what they say.
That's the other part. That's what they say. Who knows? Now we got this Ivins guy kind of like scapegoating this whole thing, whether he did it or not, we don't know.
But, well, it gets more interesting. So then there was one specific flask, if you could believe it, flask RMR 1029, and using various lab techniques, they were able to find that the parent material for the anthrax spore powder that was used came from this specific flask. And then the FBI claims that Ivins has sole control over this flask. So it seems like an open and shut case. They said, in August 2008, the U.S. attorney said basically he had control over this. And so this is probably, we feel he's the sole perpetrator.
Not the U.S. attorney, to be clear.
Ivins, yes.
Ivins guy.
But then, and to make things even more kind of like to support the FBI case, Ivins did the following. He told a mental health counselor more than a year before the attack that he was interested in a young woman who lived out of town, and he mixed a poison that he was going to use. And he's going to watch her play in a soccer game, and if she lost, he was going to poison her. Like, he told a counselor this. The counselor was so alarmed by the emotionless, specific description of the plan that she alerted the head of her clinic and a psychiatrist and the police department. And the police said, well, we can't do anything because we don't have the woman's name or address, so we don't know. He also told a different therapist in 2008 that he planned to kill his coworkers and go out in a blaze of glory. And his psychiatrist, a guy named Dr. David Irwin, called him homicidal, sociopathic, with clear intentions. And then to make it even worse, he was actually working with the FBI during their investigation. So there's allegations that he provided them false samples to kind of throw them off the case.
Throw them off the scent.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
So that sounds pretty damning, right? But
I want to say yes, but there's
other things that make you think about, was this really something that happened? In fact, when you actually look at the people who were in the lab where he worked, the FBI said he was the only person who could have exposure to it. But then actually they said, no, actually it could be more like 10 scientists had regular access to the anthrax stock. And then there were visitors and other people coming in, etc. So then they said, no, actually it's more like 419 people had access to this anthrax. Suddenly,
small alteration.
That's right. The other problem is, so lots of other people could have gotten access to the anthrax. Second of all, there is no way the FBI in any way could place him by that New Jersey mailbox in Princeton. The FBI's own genetic consultant, a woman named Claire Fraser Liggett, said that it's very unusual that there was no anthrax found in his house, his vehicles, or his belongings. And the other thing, there was a microbiologist who worked at the Army's Biodefense Lab in Maryland, where Ivins had worked, and this guy named Henry Hain. And he said, actually, we did not have the technology back in 2001 in this lab to produce the quantity of spores and the type of spores. He's just like, it wasn't possible. And he said also, there's really no way that the lab techs who worked with Ivins or everybody else would have not known about this, because there would have been anthrax floating around into the lab, into the animal cages, in the offices. He said you would have had dead.
But as you said, Ivins was a top biodefense researcher, right? So he would have taken precautions against that. But this is ridiculously interesting.
Anyway, so in the end, like we said, the FBI said he's the sole perpetrator. And in fact, there was pressure from the Obama government to not reopen the case or have an independent investigation into it, because they just wanted this done and finished. One sole perpetrator, whatever. But lots of people say there at least had to be more people if he was keeping all this anthrax under wraps somehow and not contaminating the rest of it. So in the end, the National Academy of Science did an independent report. So it wasn't like another policing organization looking at it. It was the National Academy of Sciences. And in February of 2011, they released a report saying it's impossible to reach any definitive conclusion about the origins of the anthrax in the letters based on the available scientific evidence. And they said they challenged the FBI's assumption that a single spore batch of anthrax was maintained by Ivins at his laboratory, and that was the parent material which was used to create more spores for the letters. They just did not think that that was a reasonable conclusion.
Okay, this is crazy. I mean, you said it at the beginning that this would make a great podcast, but I don't know how, Serial, the case against Adnan Syed, I don't know if you've seen that documentary, but this has got at least that much contradictory evidence that this would be amazing too. Plus, government is squashing it. Government is trying to, redirect the FBI's attention elsewhere. And, they're trying to close it down. And I understand why they would try to close it down. This is a worry that your society, your people at large, don't need to have. You got enough problems already. You don't need to add this to it. But I would love to know at this time, now that we are sort of removed from all of that, right? 2008 was when he took his own life, Ivins.
It's amazing.
Somebody. Asif, why don't you?
There we go. I'll tell you, there's one unintended consequence to these attacks. Do you know what it is?
No.
In society. So I'll give you an analogy. Right now, after the COVID pandemic, what's totally increased is streaming and stuff like that. But, Amazon doing incredibly well, home delivery, Uber Eats, Skip the Dishes, DoorDash, all these things have increased. Yeah, so what happened in 2001, which would have been a similar thing?
Was it early Netflix?
Close.
It was like the videos, they would mail the videos
that's like
to your
Redbox, or not Redbox, but early Netflix.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
It's even more big than that, because it's hard to remember, because this is 20 years ago. But this was the nail in the coffin of snail mail, essentially, where U.S. mail took a big nosedive, and especially U.S. media companies. U.S. media companies do not, every check, every bill, every letter, we don't care, send them by email. We want no part of you mailing these things to us, And so the cultural shift to email pushed everything online. That's our show for today. Hopefully you guys found our conversations interesting. Let us know what you thought about the power of the dog. Again, Ali and I don't disagree that much, but pretty big disagreement today. And let us know what you think about anthrax and that whole situation with the mail attacks. Hopefully you found that interesting as well. Reach out to us, drvcomedian@gmail.com, Dr. V Comedian on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We're everywhere. Let us know what you think. Ali, anything to plug?
Just life, life is all right. Things are opening up. I'm, psychologically, I don't know if I'm ready for all this, but, masks are going to be coming off and vaccination passports are being demanded less and less. So, I hope people are finding some comfort in that perhaps the end is in sight. Now, if you were an epidemiologist right now, you'd be like, no, do not say that we're not through it yet. But, just speaking for people's mental health, I hope you're feeling a little bit positive in a way you haven't in the last couple of years. We're kind of marking the 2-year anniversary of when the pandemic started. So on that note, I wish you all the best.
And also, you have your rebranded podcast. This podcast tastes delicious. So,
you know what? And speaking of society opening up, we do have our rebranded podcast. This podcast is delicious.
Oh, I missaid it. I said this podcast tastes delicious. It is delicious.
Is delicious. Stop trying to sabotage my other podcast, Asif.
Oh boy, jealousy. Okay, but remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues, we talk about it for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye.